Hi, in previous sessions I explained to you how TOGAF is helping us develop our architecture, enterprise architecture, by giving us the guidance on how to develop the architecture, as well as what are the important parts of the enterprise architecture. I also explained along the way how TOGAF uses certain modeling tools and frameworks in order to achieve the iterative development of enterprise architecture components throughout the architecture, such as data architecture, infrastructure architecture, application architecture, business architecture, and so on. In this session, I will be talking about the ADM, Architectural Development Model, that is allowing us to develop certain components, architectural components for our enterprise. Key points about ADM will be ADM might need adoption due to enterprises' circumstances and to be integrated with other frameworks. This is what we explained before, that we can actually integrate ADM with other architectural frameworks such as Zachman and so on in order to take advantage of all capabilities of these tools. ADM is an iterative over the whole process between phases and within phases. So basically this is the iterative or cycle of developing applications, data, or business services for different building blocks for enterprise architecture. Remember, we talked about how these building blocks are accumulated in a bucket in enterprise continuum. That's something that we'll talk about this later in this session. ADM is also for each iteration decides what the scope is, what needs to be leveraged in the organization's enterprise continuum. So basically every time we use ADM, we do an iteration. Throughout this iteration, we will discuss the scope of the work to be done and also how these are relevant to enterprise continuum, and we also use the enterprise continuum components in order to achieve that. Scoping. It has to be done for every architectural activity. So every time we wanted to develop something or we wanted to manipulate something or change something, we definitely need to have a scope in order to make sure that we are doing what it needs to be done, nothing more and nothing less. We have to scope because of limitations in time, human resources, and finances. So we have to develop the artifacts and capabilities throughout the enterprise based on the budget allocated to it and also the limitations that we have in terms of skills, human resources, and also the deadlines that may be applicable. Different scoping dimensions we can recognize as horizontal scope, which is an enterprise scope. Basically is about what part of the enterprise we are working on. Are we working on business services? Are we working on application services, data services, or infrastructure? So we have to indicate that in order to make sure that we are not trespassing from one capability to another. The other thing is the architecture domains. Basically, what domain of the architecture we are working on. And finally, vertical scope, which is the details. How much of a detail we wanted to explain in this scope. Basically, the granularity of the scope is in interest. Scoping decisions made must create value to the enterprise. So we cannot just do things for the sake of doing them. for example, having new technologies or replacing an old technology with a new one just for the sake of having a new technology. It has to it has to be justified. And one important part of the justification is to create value for the enterprise. If it doesn't create value, then it won't worth doing. Okay, now we get into the important parts of the ADM ADM phases. Sorry, just ignore this 8.1. That's just at the moment the latest version of TOGAF is 9. We're talking about 9. The TOGAF is, as you can see, it looked like this circle. We go through this circle or cycle in an iterative manner, and then in every iteration we develop a enterprise component as needed. For each phase, we have to define the objectives, what is the goals and what are the things that we are going to achieve, approach and how we going to achieve this goal, inputs, steps and output. Of course, what is it we are adding, what ingredients we are adding to this approach, to this development, and what are the steps or the process required to achieve these objectives. And finally, what are the outputs of this process? Basically, what are the capabilities and the things that we are creating at the end of this process? For example, the artifacts or the outputs of this process. Okay, the first phase or the first activity in ADM is the preliminary phase. In this phase, we make sure all who should be involved are committed. Basically, we need to recognize all the stakeholders of this activity. Whoever is concerned about this activity has to be involved, and we make sure they are committed to this involvement, to this activity. Then we have to define the architecture principles and assumptions. We need to indicate what are our principles in terms of architecture, and then what are the assumptions in this architectural development. Then we create a list of people performing it and their locations and responsibilities. We need to know who is involved in this process and what are they doing. Basically, is mostly a project management activity. Then we define the framework and methodology. So we need to know what frameworks we're using and what are the methodologies of development. Then we're defining the procedures for evaluation. So we need to know whether we've been successful or not. Therefore, we need to evaluate our outcomes and also activities and tasks. After that, the second phase is architectural vision. During the architectural vision phase, we need to validate the business principles and business goals and strategies, and the strategies that are driving the business within the organization. So we basically need to know what principles, what business principles are important to us. Make sure that we adhere to those principles and strategic business drivers of the organizations. For example, whether it's a production, whether it's a sales, whether it's a service delivery, or whatever business principles are, we have to know what are the drivers of these strategic business drivers. Then we define the scope of and to identify and prioritize the components of the current architectural efforts. Then we have to again we scope the efforts that we are going to do. Make sure that we adhere to the time limits, and we use all the capabilities that is available to us in terms of human resources, skills, and also financially, we need to make sure that we are within the budget. We need to define the relevant stakeholders and their concerns and objectives. Now, in the first preliminary phase, we needed to make sure that all the stakeholders are involved. But in this phase, we basically making sure to understand different stakeholders that we already know. We listed them. What are their concerns and objectives? For example, what is a concern of a CFO? Obviously, a CFO is more concerned about things like earnings, revenues, expenses, or probably something to do with long-term financial health of the organization. So, as a stakeholder, a CFO, we need to know what their concern is, and then we need to know what their objective is. For example, an objective of a CFO could be something around increase of revenue or things like that, or probably reduction of liabilities and so on. Define the key business requirements to be addressed in these architectural efforts and the constraints that must be dealt with. So basically, we gather all the requirements for this iteration, and we need to know exactly what we are developing and what are the requirements. And these requirements are to be driven from the concerns and objectives of stakeholders. So concerns and objectives of stakeholders are the derivative of our key business requirements. And then when we recognize our key business requirements, we can also have a look at our constraints and things that we need to be dealing with. For example, as a constraint, you may have architectural constraints, things that you cannot do. It is possible to do somewhere else, but it's not possible to do in this current architecture of the business. Or perhaps some technological constraints, some requirements need to be done, but we don't have the technical or technological capability for it. We have to deal with these constraints. Secure formal approval to process. This is going to, justification in higher management. So people have to approve the process and the proceeds of this development task. Phase B is a business architectural phase. So basically, now we know the requirements, now we know who the stakeholders are, and we know what their concerns and restraints and everything is. We know the scope of the development, and we also approved the proceeds of this development. Now we are in a phase of starting a business architecture. So everything starts from the business architecture. So we need to indicate what kind of services, business services are to be developed. So we describe the current baselines of business architecture, and also the tools we use basically are similar to UML tools, things that basically create artifacts and diagrams using a language like UML. Then we develop a target business architecture. We describe the product or service strategies and the organizational, functional processes, information, and geographical aspects of the business environments based on the business principles and business goals and strategies. So you need to know what is the target, and you have to take into place all the different parameters or derivatives of this development in this target, anything that it could be involved in development. Then we analyze the gaps between baseline and the target business. So step one was to see where we are, or what they usually call as is in this task. And then in the second task, we indicate the to be. So what is the target? are we trying to achieve during this cycle. And then in here, we analyze the gap, see what is the difference between this, and what are the things we need to add in order to achieve the objectives of the second step. Development step C is the informational systems architecture. Again, very similar to step B. We develop target architecture covering either or both, depending on project scope of the data and application systems domain. So we need to figure out what are we standing at this point, and we need to know what is the as-is situation. Then we look at the data, and we define the major types and sources of data necessary to support the business defined in the previous step. So in previous step, we say, all right, these are the business services we wanted to have. This is our goal, okay? And then now we need to know what data and applications probably, what data basically is, what kind of information is required in order to deliver those services. We also look at applications. We define the major kind of application systems necessary to process the data and support the business. We describe as logical groups of capabilities without reference to particular technologies. So we don't talk about technologies in this phase. We only wanted to figure out what capabilities in terms of application we require in order to deliver the business services promised in step B. Technology architecture. In this phase, we develop a technology architecture that will form the basis of the following implementation work. So basically, we need to know what kind of infrastructure and we need to support the applications and data, in turn those to support our business case. As part of this phase, the architecture team will need to consider what relevant technology architecture resources are available in architectural continuum. We'll talk about this architectural continuum later again. We need to use those, consume them, or if there is anything left or there is a gap, then we have to produce them and put them back into the bucket that we talked about last session. Phase E is opportunities and solutions. We need to evaluate and select among the implementation options identified in the development of the previous target architecture, for example, build versus buy or and reuse and so on. So basically in here we're deciding what are the acquiring methodology. So how we acquire these capabilities. All right, we know these are the services. In step B, we indicated the target service delivery area. In C and D, we indicated what type of information systems, architecture, data, and technology we need to deliver that business promise and business service. Now in here, we need to figure out how to acquire these capabilities, whether we're going to build them in-house, whether we're going to outsource them or buy them off the shelf, and so on. The other thing is to identify the strategic parameters for change and the top-level work packages or projects to be undertaken in moving from the current environment to the target. This step is mostly about change management. So we need to make sure that all these transition from the current as-is situation into the promised to-be situation is happening, will happen in a smooth and less troubled transition. we generate an overall implementation and migration strategy. So the migration transition needs to be planned and implemented very carefully. One more thing I need to identify here is that these phases, of course, every phase has its own tasks and targets to be achieved and tasks to be done. But at the end of the day, depending on different types of projects and the sizes of these different projects, some of the tasks could be modified as important, urgent, and also not too important, and probably less emphasis on different types of different tasks during this process. In phase F, we're looking at migration planning. So we have to sort the various implementation projects into priority order. A little bit of a project management activity going on in here, and we need to know the prioritization and critical path throughout this development. If we need to develop different types of capabilities and artifacts, we need to prioritize them and also make sure what comes after what, and to make sure that things are done in a orderly manner, so we can utilize the most of our capabilities and resources during the development. Therefore, we can generate a detailed implementation plan. And in phase G, we do the implementation and governance. We formulate the recommendations for each implementation project. So if this development requires more than one implementation, which will definitely is most of the time, we need to create recommendations and for every project, and then perform the appropriate governance function while the system is being implemented and deployed. We also have to ensure conformance with the defined architecture. So we always have the overall architecture of the enterprise, so enterprise architecture in mind, the current thing. And then we make sure every piece or every building block that we add to this new architecture confirms with the overall goals and overall definition of this architecture. We make sure that nothing is out of whack for the current or target architecture, enterprise architecture. Step H is architectural change management. During the change management, we provide for continual monitoring of such things as new development in technology and changes in the business environment, and for determining whether to formally initiate a new architecture evaluation cycle. So it's all about change management. And when we are in a delivery phase and we are also in a support phase, we need to make sure that what we're developing is pretty well supportable, and it also fits into our change management procedures. Architecture requirements management. This is not really a phase. This is a particular task that it relates to every single task around it. And as you can see, that's why we put it in the middle. So in every phase, we also reference to the requirements, and we need to manage the requirements of that particular phase. So it's not a static set of requirements, but a dynamic process whereby requirements for enterprise architecture and subsequent changes to those requirements are identified, stored, and fed into the out of the relevant ADM phases. It also changes such as changing market conditions and new legislations. So we in other phases like A, B, C, D, and E, and so on, we have some sort of static requirements and static procedures and tasks, and things are set to an extent set to be done, but due to some other moving parts, such as it's mentioned here, legislation and market conditions, these requirements are subject to change, and we need to be able to manage the changes or modification of requirements. And that is the thing we're talking about in here in the middle, is that we need to have a capability of change management or requirements change management for every single phase in ADM. Now that we know how this ADM cycle works, we go back and explain a little bit about the enterprise continuum, because nonetheless, this development is that the final product of this development is just another piece of the puzzle, or it's another building block of this enterprise architecture. So we developed this building block of enterprise architecture, and we want to put it back into the enterprise continuum and use it somewhere that it's needed. So therefore, we have to go back to the enterprise continuum with reference to that continuum all the time. So again, simple explanation, it's a repository of reusable building blocks. ADM both uses readily build blocks from or adds some blocks that we added just in the previous slide to it. It contains work in progresses, previous works done in this organization, and reference models and patterns. Most of the reference models and patterns are the patterns and reference models provided by TOGAF that are part of the pre-existing or pre-developed, pre-built capabilities provided by the TOGAF itself. However, as we mentioned in previous sessions, during the development cycle in ADM, we develop new blocks, things that it doesn't really exist, or probably exist and it doesn't fit into our organization, and we add them into the continuum, and then we use them later when they are needed. It has a sample content, such as in the development of technology architecture. This may be a TOGAF's own foundation architecture. In the development of business architecture, it may be a reference model for e-commerce taken from some other industries. Okay, so again, a little bit of more explanation about the business enterprise continuum here. Basically, enterprise continuum specifies a progression for developing architecture and solutions using architecture building blocks and solution building blocks in a continuous iterative fashion. So iteration comes from the ADM. So in ADM, we create new building blocks, and then enterprise continuum is our big bucket, that big bucket that contains all the pre-existing or pre-built building blocks, as well as all the building blocks that we built specific to our organization, right? So a building block is simply a grouping of functionalities defined to meet the business needs. So we create a group of functionalities, and we create a new building block during the ADM life cycle. Now, these are building blocks. So an architectural building block is described with a general level of details. A solution, so this is architectural building blocks. and these are solution building blocks. So a solution building block reflects a real product or a specific custom development. And the TOGAF ADM guides us through a left to right progression from high level to low level, as you can see here. A left to right progression from the general architecture and solutions to organizational specific ones. So there are some solutions here that is general to everyone in every industry, and then as you move through this to left, you have common systems architecture, industry architecture, and these finally are very specific to our organization. Along the way we must be able to use any of these building blocks. The relationship between the architectural continuum and the solution continuum is one of guidance, direction, and support. So basically they are all about support. You build an architecture by navigating the two continuum from left to right and top to bottom, so that you are specifying architectural building blocks at each stage, and then the solution building blocks that implements them and continuing rightwards, building upon the solution and adding increasing detail.